Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Bradley J. Show, once again with Rich Rubino, who's become a super regular here, and there's a good reason for it, and that is that he's excellent. And today we're going to take a look at a couple things. One of them will be what might the ramifications of New Hampshire not being a first-in-the-nation primary be. That's going to change a lot of strategic thinking, I would guess. The minute I saw that headline, I'm walking by a store, I got to ask Rich Rubino about that. I'm sure he's going to have thoughts on that. And Kristen Sinema, we'll talk about her too. And maybe I'll ask Rich if the ongoing problems, legal problems that former President Trump is having might actually start chipping away at his base. But first, this is kind of a shocker. The fact that they're just thinking about it now. They voted to move forward with changing the order of the primaries. Is it in stone yet or not?
No. Well, first of all, this is the Democratic Party, not the Republican Party.
What, did I say Republican Party?
Oh, no, you were saying just generally. I'm just trying to differentiate between the two.
Okay.
So
right. Yes, Democratic Party.
There's a New Hampshire law going back to 1975 that stipulates that New Hampshire primary will always be about 10 days before any other state goes with their primary. And New Hampshire says they're sticking to it. So what happened here? So Joe Biden recommended essentially to the Democratic National Committee Rules and Bylaws Committee. And every time you say Rules and Bylaws Committee, I know people start to nod off, but this is interesting. But trust me on this. He recommended that South Carolina go first, and then New Hampshire, and then New Hampshire essentially would be one state that goes second the next week. Now, here's why this is interesting and why he did that. First of all, if we go back, Joe Biden, up until South Carolina in 2020, never won a primary. In 1988, he had to drop out of the race early after it was revealed, after John Sasso from the caucus campaign revealed that Joe Biden had plagiarized part of a speech from Neil Canuck, the Labor Party leader, so he never made it to the caucuses. 2008, his kind of ephemeral presidential race, he dropped out after Iowa. In 2020, he came in fifth place in New Hampshire, after going in fourth place in Iowa. And actually, he went right down to South Carolina without even being there to give his concession speech, because he knew that was essentially his last stand. There was Nevada after that. Nevada he largely ignored. So he went down to South Carolina. He garnered the endorsement of Jim Clyburn, the majority whip, probably the most important endorsement of any presidential candidate, probably since Jesse Helms endorsed Reagan in 1976. So why South Carolina? Why is that so important for him? Well, Joe Biden's base of support seems to be with the African-American community. He won over 60% of the vote in the African-American community, specifically the Southern African community in South Carolina. If you look at where Biden's base of support is versus, say, Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders is with young voters, more secular voters, whiter voters, and younger Latino voters as well. Contrary-wise, Joe Biden's base is with older voters, sometimes union members, people who are more likely to be regular attendees of church, and with African Americans specifically. That was his base. If it wasn't for South Carolina, he probably would have dropped out of the race. If he did not win South Carolina and win it convincingly, as of like almost 30 points, he would have had to drop out of the race probably the next day. So he wins South Carolina, and then as you go into Super Tuesday, other candidates, whether it's Amy Klobuchar, Pete Buttigieg, drop out and endorse him. The establishment rallies around Joe Biden because they think he's the most electable candidate in the general election. They are trepidatious about Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders. So that's basically why I think that he is doing this. The other thing, if he runs in 2020, in terms of running in New Hampshire, it's very possible in New Hampshire, that's a state where it's kind of unpredictable, and there's a possibility that an insurrectionist candidate can do very well there. 1952, Harry Truman is running for potentially a third term because he served part of Franklin Roosevelt's first term. And then, the end of his first term, and is in full second term before the 22nd Amendment, which would require you to serve only 2 terms directly. But he ran. Adlai Stevenson beat him in the primary. He dropped out. 1968, LBJ is running in the Democratic primary. Eugene McCarthy, senator from Minnesota, wins over 42% of the vote. Lyndon Johnson says, I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president. And Jimmy Carter had problems there. George H.W. Bush had problems there. So it's probably better politically for Joe Biden to kind of nip it in the bud and go right down to the state where he's probably the most popular of the three, and that is South Carolina.
Wow. Why is it that Joe Biden does well with African Americans?
For the same reason why Jimmy Carter did very well in the primaries in 1976, that was his base. Bill Clinton did very well with them in 1992. It's a very similar. Hillary Clinton did very well with them when she ran in 2016. African American voters tend to be more conservative, actually. While they're very democratic, they're very democratic. They tend to be more conservative, and they also tend to be more pragmatic, if you will. If you look at the polls, they're also more likely to be churchgoers, and that's basically the reason. They're more conservative constituency in the party, so accordingly they're going to support the candidate who is the most moderate, particularly older African Americans. By the way, this is changing a little bit if you look at younger African Americans, and this is true with almost every community. It's true with Latinos, Pacific Islanders. Generally speaking, young voters tend to gravitate more toward the liberal candidates, whereas older voters tend to gravitate more toward the moderate candidates. But that being said, last time around, Biden still won African Americans in South Carolina who are under 30 years old in that primary by 4 points. So that is his base. And you always have this kind of divide in the Democratic Party. Go back almost every year. 1992, take for example. Paul Tsongas, former senator from Massachusetts, is running, and he does very well among kind of the intellectual Democrats, if you will, the folks who have Ivy League degrees, the folks who have secondary education, the folks who essentially have bachelor's, master's degrees are more, and also the whiter voters are more likely to support Paul Tsongas. Bill Clinton did well. Contrary to that, he did well with labor unions, he did well with white working class voters, and he did well with African American voters. Last time around, very similar in South Carolina. Joe Biden does well with the traditional Democratic constituencies, older voters, people more likely to go to church, labor union folks. Bernie Sanders on the other side did very well with younger voters. He did very well with whiter voters, and he could not kind of cross that divide. He did better with African Americans than he did against Hillary Clinton in 2016, but not nearly enough to compete with Joe Biden in that state.
There seems to be an assumption that new immigrants will be Democratic voters, but is that true?
It all depends. Immigrants are not a monolith. Take Latino community, for example. On the one hand, in this last re-election bid in Florida, for example, Ron DeSantis did very well with Venezuelan voters. He did very well with Cuban voters. He did very well in Miami-Dade County. He won Miami-Dade County. First governor to do that since Jeb Bush in 2002. Those voters tend to be, at least the older ones, tend to be more conservative. Younger ones tend to be less conservative. It all depends essentially on where they're from, and it's kind of what their American experience is, how long they've been here. But you certainly can't say that kind of as a monolith, although I will say as an extreme generality, an elephantine generality here, obviously new voters are more likely to choose the Democrat than the Republican.
All right. Excuse me. Now, why don't we bring in the Sinema factor?
Yes, very interesting. So Kyrsten Sinema basically became an independent today. She's a former Democrat. Absolutely fascinating if you look at this woman's history, okay? She did not come in. She was not always a moderate. In fact, she used to be a member of the far left. She was a Ralph Nader advocate in 2000, saying that Al Gore and George W. Bush were essentially both two wings of the same bird. Essentially, she was saying at the time that they were too close together. When Joe Lieberman campaigned for president in 2004 and went to Arizona, Kyrsten Sinema was essentially saying, why is he here? He's not even a Democrat. She protested the war in Afghanistan. She protested the war in Iraq. She was somebody who came from the far left of the spectrum, and gradually she took a seat in the state legislature, started to move to the center. Then she took a seat in Congress and started continuing to move to the center and developed relationships with members of both the Republican and the Democratic Party. It's absolutely fascinating kind of where she came from, if you will. She's somebody who, for example, does not espouse being a member of any religion, which is rare, certainly in the American body politic. So she gets elected to the United States Senate the first time. In 2016, She beats Martha McSally, and the Democrats pour money into her. They figure this is somebody who's become a center-left, kind of traditional establishment Democrat who went from the left, the Ralph Nader left, to the establishment left. She gets elected barely, extremely close election. This was back in 2018, rather. So she gets elected to the Senate, and when she gets elected to the Senate, she becomes a power broker. On a lot of issues, she's still relatively, I guess you could say, establishment left, but she has moved to the right on a lot of issues and is working with Republicans to the point that Mitch McConnell actually invited her to come speak in Kentucky, and she actually went, which was certainly to the chagrin of many members of the Democratic Party. So electorally, what does this look like for her? Well, first of all, here's the most important part. Even though she became an independent, she wants to keep her committee assignments, so that means she's likely to continue to caucus with the Democratic Party. So what does that mean? If she were to essentially say she's not going to caucus with either party, which theoretically she could do, and actually there was a candidate in Utah who ran for Senate who said if he was elected, he would not caucus with either of the two major political parties, that means she gets no committee assignments. Essentially, Angus King from Maine, Bernie Sanders from Vermont are not registered as Democrats. They're registered as independents, but they caucus with the Democrats. So accordingly, the Democrats put them on their respective committees. So this does not mean that the Republicans picked up a seat. The Democrats still hold a majority because she's considered caucusing with the Democrats. And if you caucus with the Democrats, for all intents and purposes, you are a Democrat. Joe Lieberman, when he did this, he ran for re-election as a Democrat, lost to now Connecticut Governor Ned Lamont in the primary, then ran as an independent, but still caucused with the Democrats and usually voted with the Democrats, which Kyrsten Sinema likely will do as well. Now, how does this benefit her? So basically, it's homeostasis in terms of the two parties in terms of the divide in the Congress. Well, politically, Ruben Gallego, a congressman from Arizona, a former Marine, somebody who's been talked about as a potential presidential candidate at some point, is seriously considering running against her in a Democratic primary. And because of her move to the center, specifically on her support of the filibuster, when it was only her and Joe Manchin, and other issues where she's taken on the party, some members of the Democratic Party would probably galvanize toward him. And my guess is he probably would beat her in a Democratic primary because she's persona non grata in the party. Now she's an independent. Does that mean theoretically that she could run as an independent? She can. She could run as an independent and say, I'm going to caucus with the Democrats. She could run as an independent and say she's going to caucus with the Republicans as well. Or she could essentially say, I'm not going to run for re-election. She could say the country's too polarized and then take a job either in the private sector, or she could take a job as some sort of an advocate on television, something to that effect. But it's interesting. I think from an electoral standpoint, she's basically copying what Joe Lieberman did, and she's going to probably try to run as an independent and say she's going to caucus with the Democrats. And electorally, that's probably advantageous for her.
It is. So she's more likely to get reelected after this, you figure?
Yeah, I cannot envision the scenario where she wins a Democratic primary. Now, what she could have done, the Lieberman thing, what Lieberman did, Lieberman runs in the primary, and then after the primary, well, actually during the primary, he's collecting the signatures. He loses in the primary, then he's on the ballot as an independent, and it's a three-way race with a very weak Republican. He wins the general election. So she theoretically could do that. She could run as an independent. It's very hard, as I say, to run as an independent because you don't have that kind of party infrastructure. But she has ecumenical name recognition, so I could see a scenario where that would actually happen.
Okay. Herschel Walker, did he lose by more than you thought he would lose? Or
He lost by about what I thought he was going to lose by because that state is so closely divided. And if you look at it, the biggest predictor in terms of who somebody's going to vote for today is not necessarily personality as much as it is party registration.
Yeah.
The Democrats vote for Warnock, the Republicans vote for Herschel Walker. But that being said, there was a candidate quality issue. And I think some candidates, whether it's Dan Bullock in New Hampshire or Dr. Oz in Pennsylvania, there were some candidates around the country that probably did not reflect the vision of their voters in very moderate states. And in the case of Herschel Walker, I think that he came within 3 points of winning, first of all. But if there was a more, dare I say, establishment type of a candidate who actually were to muster the nomination, and somebody who was potentially not such a lightning rod as Herschel Walker was, I think they probably would have had a better chance. Now, it's interesting because you hear this sometimes. People will say, conservatives will say, the reason the Republicans are not hegemonic over the United States Senate is because of Mitch McConnell. They say his super PAC did not spend nearly enough money on places like Georgia, and he spent too much money in Alaska where they have a blanket primary. So in other words, it doesn't matter where you're a Republican or Democrat, everyone kind of runs together. And they put a lot of money in Lisa Murkowski, a moderate, for her to essentially win so that she could win in Alaska, because Republicans always support incumbents. I don't necessarily buy that. I think it's more an argument of simply that there were states where states like Georgia and Pennsylvania, where they had candidates who were out of step with the constituency. In Pennsylvania, the nominee they had was probably out of step with the Democratic constituency. But this was a state where Hillary Clinton absolutely creamed Bernie Sanders, but you had a Bernie Sanders supporter, but he was still able to have a victory in the state of Pennsylvania. In the state of Georgia, though, I will say Raphael Warnock was a very formidable and a very charismatic candidate. And Herschel Walker on the other side of that is somebody who has very well name recognition. And because he was such a college superstar, there are many people potentially who only came out to vote for him because of that, because he's kind of from somebody from outside of politics. So that's an interesting scenario too.
Now to former President Trump. It seems though he's becoming more and more fringe talking, what he said about the Constitution and things of that nature, plus more documents. I mean, even the most staunch supporters must say after a while, dude, what is up? It seems to me that even his core supporters must be kind of flaking off little by little, maybe not. And if not, why not?
Well, there's about 40% that will stay with him probably until the last dog dies. They are not going anywhere.
Because they love him. Is it because specifically him, not because they are conservative, because of the cult of personality?
Yeah.
What do they see? 40% is a lot. What do they see in him that they love so much?
Part of it is being part of an affinity group. And the affinity group, this is true with, a lot of other presidential candidates as well, but probably more so for him, is essentially that there was somebody from outside of the establishment, someone who takes on, they think, both parties. A lot of these are people who are very disaffected. They talk very negatively about Mitch McConnell as well as Nancy Pelosi. They're very critical of the Clintons, but they're also very critical of George W. Bush. They were against the Iraq War, and so was Donald Trump. They were against NAFTA, and so was Donald Trump. So he has that constituency, and they're very much against illegal immigration, and so was Donald Trump. So on those trifecta of issues, that is Donald Trump's main constituency, and they believe he's the first president that's actually addressed their issues.
So they think that even though other Republican candidates might talk the talk, they don't walk the walk like Trump did.
Yes, absolutely. And the fact on free trade specifically, NAFTA has become a four-letter word in places like Ohio, in places like Erie County, Pennsylvania, which he flipped in 2016, for example. And he's the first candidate. He's the first, I think, mainstream presidential candidate, and certainly the mainstream Republican. Every Republican from Eisenhower to Romney was basically a free trader who basically stood up to that. And that's, I think, partly why they stand with him. Now, there are some Republicans who these are the problem for him, are the ones who liked his policies but are kind of becoming incredulous toward him. And those are the ones that could potentially go toward an opponent of Donald Trump in the primary. They're saying, do we really need Donald Trump's baggage in the general election? They're saying, can Donald Trump really appeal to a broad cross-section of constituencies? They say, well, look, he's never won 50% of the vote. He's never had job approval over 50% of the vote. And they say, look what happened in the last midterm elections. He lost the 2018 midterm elections. He lost 2000. And this time around, the Democrats, for the first time since 1962, actually picked up a seat in their first midterm election with a Democratic president. First time since 1934 with Franklin Roosevelt that no Democratic senator lost their offices in the first midterm election with a Democratic president. They say that's because of kind of this penumbra of Donald Trump, if you will. And they're saying maybe we should go for somebody else. And there's others that are completely never Trumpers who say, Donald Trump was never really a Republican. He hijacked the party. He's really a Republican in name only. He changed our ideology. and they're going to go for someone like Larry Hogan, who will say, let's go back kind of to the basics, the status quo ante, if you will, the Republican Party before Donald Trump. But he really is such a lightning rod in the party. And those are, I think, the three kind of branches, the three bloodlines, if you will, in the contemporaneous Republican Party.
So it's the 40% of hardcore Trump voters that are dragging the party down. It's that 40%, which is a giant amount. How does the party deal with those folks? How do they pry them away from Trump?
It's very hard. I don't think, barring a cataclysm, that is going to happen. And where it's perilous is the more candidates that get in the race, they're going to split the anti-Donald Trump vote. If it's Donald Trump versus one other candidate, if there's only one candidate in the primary, it's a perilous situation for Donald Trump. There are 363 people running, and they're all splitting the anti-Trump vote. Trump can do exactly what he did last time. He didn't win a majority of the vote until the 32nd state, and that was New York State, his home state. He was winning 39, 40, 41%. All the other Republicans were splitting the anti-Trump vote. That's the best possible scenario for him. And I cannot see a scenario where all the Republican candidates kind of consolidate toward one person. If for no other reason, then there's certainly going to be a divide. There's going to be a splinter group and an aperture between the Larry Hogan wing, who's very much never Trumpers, and folks like Ron DeSantis or Greg Abbott or Asa Hutchinson who say, well, there's a lot we like about Trump's policies, but we think we need a divergent messenger.
Now, as far as the president's legal troubles, I was thinking that, politically speaking, it would be better for the Democrats if the Department of Justice just waited till after even 2 years. But it almost seems like Trump is making that impossible. He's making it so that they cannot, in all good conscience, avoid doing something before that, especially with the documents scenario. I mean, the January 6th scenario is kind of fuzzy, but the documents are not fuzzy, and there continue to be, especially if there continue to be more documents here and there. This is a slap in the face to the Department of Justice and the rule of law and everything. How can they not move forward? And what will be the political ramifications of that? It seems like any attack on Trump always helps him. Is he almost hoping they do so that politically his base will become fired up again?
From a political standpoint, yeah, maybe not from a legal standpoint, but certainly from a political standpoint, I'm sure that's exactly what he's thinking. He's thinking that I'm going to be able to essentially galvanize and fire up, if you will, my base, and it's going to be very much us versus them. And maybe I'm going to be able to bring some conservatives over to my cause, some who may be a little bit skeptical, who might be saying, look at this witch hunt that they're taking on. Look at this witch hunt they're taking on against Donald Trump. I need to kind of consolidate, and I need to stick with my president. I think that's part of what he would think. And he would very much say that this is going to, just the fact that he, generally speaking, is going to say that this is going to be us versus them. And that's how Donald Trump won the last time, certainly. And, he's not the only person who's run those type of kind of populist type platforms. There are plenty of folks on the left. I mean, Huey Long from Louisiana, for example, got elected by talking about every man a king. George Wallace used to talk about the poor getting poorer and the rich getting richer when he ran for governor of Alabama last time in 1982. So Donald Trump is not the first person to try this, but I think that he will certainly use his alleged ethical indiscretions to his advantage.
So let's see. Annette here says, why are we even discussing Trump being a viable candidate? He should be forbidden to hold office. The reason is a polls show that he has a support of 40% of the voters. So it would be weird not to discuss a candidate that controls 40% of the vote. Believe me, I agree with you, Annette. And as soon as it's possible to stop, to ignore that particular candidate, I'm very happy to do that. So, all right. It does seem, though, that even the most fanatic Trump voter would know deep inside that it's not a witch hunt after a while. So there's nothing fuzzy about it like January 6th. His team lied about, on paper, about having more documents. Maybe they don't care about documents, but even that, the right used to be the rule of law party, and they're seeing that he has these documents that may have been given to our enemies or we may have fallen into the hands of our enemies and may continue to be. People's lives are at risk because of these documents being out there. The identity of secret agents. And if our enemies know what we know, that is very detrimental to us. If our enemies know about our nuclear capability and intentions, that's detrimental to us. Even the most diehard Trump fan must see deep inside that it's not a witch hunt. It's really protecting the interest of the United States and the rule of law. But I'm guessing you'll say, no, they don't see that.
I just think it's, I don't know exactly what the psychological profile is, but I do think that this is very much, it's very much kind of almost like if one, it's like supporting one sports team over another, and this goes on the other side as well. And I think as soon as any sort of a scandal, whether it's Watergate, whether it's Iran-Contra, Monica Lewinsky, I think obviously folks who have an affinity toward Donald Trump will galvanize toward him, and folks who don't have an affinity against Donald Trump will certainly galvanize against him. And I think that's certainly, that's certainly politics. Very rarely is there someone who's universally kind of condemned.
All right.
I could think of a few examples, maybe Rod Blagojevich in Illinois, for example.
That's interesting. He's a historian. Why don't you give us a list of candidates that were universally condemned?
It's very rare. Everyone has a certain constituency and a certain base. I'm going to think of a couple. I'm going to think Rod Blagojevich, the governor of Illinois. If you remember, for allegedly trying to sell Obama's Senate seat in 2018, he said it was effing golden at the time. Eventually, he instead of resigning, let it go to the House, let it go to the Senate. And he's basically unanimously condemned and impeached and then convicted in the House and the Senate in Illinois. And then he ended up going to jail. But even before that, he had a job approval rating of about 13%. And the day before this happened, he said, the sun is shining on me. There's no problems. Then essentially this all comes out, and it takes up certainly Obama part of the transition team. And he's extremely unpopular with both the Democrats and the Republican Party. Governor Taft in Ohio was extremely unpopular. There was some kind of minor scandals that affected him. I think Chris Christie, actually, after the so-called Bridgegate, and folks started to think it went a bridge too far, left with a job approval rating of under 20%, which is certainly, which was one of the lowest job approval ratings of any governor. But in terms of an actual president, the lowest I think you can go actually was Truman. Truman in 1952, he tried to run in the primary. At least he had people put his name on the ballot in New Hampshire. He loses to Estes Kefauver. Then he decides he's not going to run. But at the time, the Republicans, even though he wasn't on the ballot, they tried to run against him. They ran against Korea, corruption, and communism. Truman had essentially just made the decision to send U.S. troops into the Korean War. It seemed like a stalemate. Body bags were coming back. There was no real end in sight. He became unpopular. In China, Chiang Kai-shek had essentially Mao Zedong had taken over mainland China. Chiang Kai-shek, our former ally, ended up having to move to Taiwan. And Republicans and even some Democrats were saying, who lost China? They were blaming it on Harry Truman. And there was corruption in his administration, including some kind of members of the Treasury Department. They used to say to err is Truman at the time. He left office with a 22% job approval rating. No one in the history of polling has had a lower job approval rating than Truman had in 1952. That's the lowest we've gotten. Other than that, you had Nixon at 24% and George W. Bush at about 25%. But in all three of those cases, they still had about 20% that still somewhat supported them. I can think of Blagojevich, Taft, and Christie as probably the three most unpopular governors. Jane Swift, the acting governor of Massachusetts, at some point in her administration, at the beginning of her administration, was extremely unpopular. People said, how did she get the job? But then after the way she handled 9/11, her job approval rating started to increase a little bit. But there's always going to be people that are going to be for Trump, essentially, no matter what, and they're just going to consolidate and continue to be for Donald Trump.
So what does it say over the door of the Supreme Court? Equality under the law.
Equal justice under law, yeah.
Equal justice. That's a pipe dream. It's pretty clear that is not even close to being the case.
That's a theoretical concept. When human beings are involved, first of all, I think self-preservation is probably the first rule of human nature in many respects. And that's something, it's obviously an ideal. It's like the Constitution. We're always looking for to form a more perfect union. So we've never actually gone to that state where it is perfect. But whenever human beings are essentially involved, I think we have ideals, but we also have that self-preservation. And I think certainly you're never going to have a scenario, just like in news, you're never going to have a scenario where you're getting completely unbiased news because someone's choosing what to emphasize in that story. You have a soundbite, someone's choosing, I'm going to pick this soundbite rather than this soundbite. Someone else is choosing, I'm going to have this is our first story and this is our second story. So they're forming an opinion. In terms of this, essentially, I think people may try to go in trying to be unbiased. I think people try to be unbiased. But I think for the most part, human beings have emotions. We're not, despite what some might think of politicians, we're not robots. We do have we are thinking beings, and any thinking being does have some sort of an opinion. And in terms of politics, we gravitate toward people we like. And then one thing the internet has done, probably to the chagrin of many folks, is essentially it's brought us into our silos, or our kind of asylums, even, if you will, where we immediately go and we want to be with people who agree with us. You immediately see this and you say, oh, this person is saying something I agree with. Maybe I should listen to this politician who's also saying that. And then you get to the point where essentially you think that there's kind of this ideological Manichaeanism where I'm on the right side, the other person's on the wrong side, and there is no room for compromise.
Speaking of social media, et cetera, that contributes to bias even more than the human factor. The algorithms that put crazy stuff to the top,
Yep,
and really more biased than Fox or MSNBC. They cause that. I think is one rule that needs to be legislated, that the social media has to come up with another way to decide which stories get shown and not misrepresent reality purposely with their algorithm.
Well, even in the case of, and here's kind of a misnomer. People on the right think that everyone on the left, and I'm talking beyond the kind of the internet, watches MSNBC and reads the New York Times. People on the left think that everyone on the right watches Fox News and maybe reads the Wall Street Journal and maybe used to listen to Rush Limbaugh. Actually, a lot of people on the right, if you listen to them and you say the word Fox News, they'll say, oh, Murdoch, that's just part of the corporate media. That's part of the military-industrial complex. We don't watch this. So they're going to maybe watch One America, or they're going to get their news from alternative sources, certainly including what they're seeing on Facebook. Very similar, and this is that part where Ralph Nader's bicycle crams right into goes right into Pat Buchanan's Mercedes.
Right.
Boom. On the far left, people on the left are not watching MSNBC and CNN and the New York Times. They're maybe watching One America. They're watching alternative sources because they're going to say CNN, MSNBC, they're all part of the corporate media as well. They're all part of the military-industrial complex. They're tribunes for Raytheon or something to that effect. So people are getting, the people on the right think the people on the left are getting all their news from these establishment sources. The people on the left think the people on the right are getting it from conservative establishment sources, when in reality, many of them are getting from sources that are just kind of anti-establishment whatsoever. They're anti-Fox, they're anti-CNN, they're anti pretty much anything that is run by a corporation.
I would agree with you, with anyone who is computer savvy, but it is surprising the number of older folks are still like, that's not where I'm getting I'm not doing my banking there. I don't trust a computer like that. I'm still turning on the old TV and watching whatever they have to offer there.
And the people that actually wait till 6:30, it's amazing. That we're still in an era where there are people that wait till 6:30 to watch the news and actually read a physical paper.
Right. Now, if for me, I'm looking at news and it's more than 4 hours old, it's like, ugh, that's garbage. Get it out of here. I'm looking for something that's 2 hours old. I guess anything else? Oh, back to equality under the law. Pipe dream. I mean, you say that we make an effort to that, but I don't see it. The system still favors rich people and politically large people. Anyone even doing anything close to what the former President Trump has done would be locked up and thrown away the key. But he gets to continue to taunt and slap and ignore the Department of Justice and the establishment that has been set up to protect the national security of the United States. He gets to do that because he's rich and because he has it's the fear of his 40% following becoming violent, really, or the political fear of his 40% being galvanized and reelecting him. Whatever. He's not good at governing, but he's good at running. He knows how to get elected. He knows how to play the game, and it's very sad. The idea of equality under the law, not even close. It's sad to me.
But when you say that,
you get busted for a parking ticket, they will come. They will slap some sanction on your license. They're not even slapping sanctions on. I don't even know if the president has a driver's license, but I don't see any punishment yet.
Well, it's interesting. Actually, I think George H.W. Bush was asked about this on Larry King in '92. He actually took out his license and showed it. And Hillary Clinton actually in 1996 on Election Day in Little Rock decided she was with a bunch of friends and an attorney's friends. And she went out in her car and actually drove. And that was the last time we know that she actually drove a automobile. So there is some precedent for presidents actually driving. George W. Bush, certainly Lyndon Johnson used to drive a lot on their ranch. Now, in terms of Donald Trump, all I'll say is there's going to be plenty of people that will see this on social media will immediately comment and they'll say bias. What you're saying is liberal bias. And there's no way of really kind of getting out of that other than to say that there are people on the left, there are people on the right that are going to see bias in essentially any argument that they disagree with. But then there are a bunch of people kind of in the middle, or people that are just kind of insouciant about the whole thing, who just don't care about the whole thing, who are saying, why are people kind of arguing about this? Why are they arguing about Donald Trump's ethics? Why are they arguing about Hunter Biden? Why don't we focus on the issues? Why don't we focus on inflation? And that's something actually, a counter argument that I think Donald Trump could potentially use. He could say, they want to talk about all this, and whereas I want to talk about the issues. And Joe Biden can essentially say the same thing. They can say the Republicans want to investigate Hunter Biden. I want to talk about the Inflation Reduction Act or something to that effect. But that's always what a politician's kind of last refuge is always, let's talk about the issues.
Can you flesh out the Hunter Biden thing and maybe and I don't understand how it's in any way equivalent, but the one party does say that it's kind of an equivalent. Oh yeah, you're gonna be mean to President Trump. We're gonna go get Hunter Biden. That doesn't seem to weigh out to me, but maybe you can explain why they feel it does.
Not really, but it's just a lot of it is certainly politics. They talk about about Hunter Biden's influence with the Chinese government influence. There's plenty, if you look it up, and you can find this from all different sources about what kind of Hunter Biden's influence was. There are some folks in the Republican Party, Rudy Giuliani, for example, used to say that, most people always thought Joe Biden was dumb, but he was a nice guy. But then we find out about this Hunter Biden thing. Does this mean that he's corrupt? But essentially, it does kind of equal the playing field in terms of Republicans saying, you went after Donald Trump, now we're going to go after Joe Biden. Look at all the influence he has. Look at all the influence of it. Look at all the influence of his son. And that's certainly, it's very much politics. It's like, during Whitewater, when they went after Bill Clinton and they went after Monica Lewinsky, then Democrats found out that Republicans like Dan Burton, Henry Hyde, and Newt Gingrich had affairs as well. So they went after him for that. And the Republicans like Newt Gingrich came back and said, well, it's not so much about Bill Clinton's affair. It's the fact that he lied under oath, which is perjury. And Bill Clinton's folks can come back and say, yeah, but it was in a civil trial and a tangentially related issue. So this is just kind of the tug of war of American politics, and it's been there since time immemorial. Since there was people who wanted to keep the Articles of Confederation, who wanted less government, and people wanted wanted a more expansive central government, who wanted the United States Constitution. It's just going to be here. I don't see that necessarily any form of a solution where everyone kind of gets united. We just don't live essentially in that body politic today.
Okay. One thing that is interesting is the fact that the right and the left are cut from different cloth, and the right generally doesn't care about, they will stick with their candidate as long as the candidate is doing what they want, whereas the left will purity test the when the left comes after Trump because of the cloth they are cut from, that galvanizes them to support their candidate, whereas the purity testing left it actually might have an effect, a negative effect on their candidate, because they are less likely to rally around a candidate being attacked. They're more likely to join in and tear their own guy down because of their purity testing nature.
Yeah, purity tests. Purity tests, generally speaking, and you always have this scenario. There are ideologues in both parties that say the reason we're losing is because we have not been able to get our message out. If enough people hear our message, they're going to support us. Okay, now this may be true, and obviously in a liberal state like Massachusetts, a conservative state like Idaho, if you run to the far right or the far left, you have a very good chance of getting elected. You do that in another state, you do that in certainly if someone like Jeff Deal, for example, in Massachusetts, tries to run as a traditional full spectrum conservative in Massachusetts. Well, mathematically, the Republican Party has less than 10% of registered voters, and they're unenrolled voters. Most of those vote Democrat. So it's basically immutable. It's almost impossible for that Republican to do that. And there's really never been a conservative who's been elected statewide in Massachusetts. Same thing if you run as, when Bob Kerrey in 2012 tried to run for a Senate seat in Nebraska, and he said he was for the Affordable Care Act. Well, he was very much too liberal at that time for Nebraska, so he ended up losing that Senate seat to Deb Fischer. 1964, Barry Goldwater, finally the conservatives nominate somebody who's an unadulterated conservative. He acerbates at the Republican National Convention, the Cow Palace down in San Francisco. Extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice. Moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue. And conservatives say, yes, we have somebody who's singing from our hymn book, someone who's singing from our song sheet. What happens in the general election? He wins one state out of the Deep South, and that's his home state of Arizona. Then the party kind of reconvenes in 1968. They nominate a moderate in Richard Nixon, and they win. 1972, George McGovern was 200-1 long shot, but the Democratic liberal intelligentsia said this is the guy we want as a nominee, not Hubert Humphrey, not Scoop Jackson, not anybody else. He wins the nomination. They say we finally have somebody who's an unadulterated liberal who's going to sing from our hymn book. General election, he does very well with liberal Democrats, but very few other voters. He ends up winning one state, Massachusetts, in the District of Columbia. So 1976, the moderates come back and say, we need somebody who can actually be electable. They nominate a former Georgia governor, Southern moderate Baptist, and Jimmy Carter ends up winning. They have a few scenarios. 1992, for example, when every candidate, essentially after they lost 3 elections in a row, the Democrats are saying, we need somebody who's moderate to win the nomination. So you have Bill Clinton, Doug Wilder, Paul Tsongas, Bob Kerrey, all running to essentially the right, running as moderates. And then you have Tom Harkin, senator from Iowa, running as an unadulterated, unreconstructed liberal, saying he's an unapologetic liberal. The Democratic base at that time says, no, we want someone who's electable. We like Tom Harkin ideologically. If we go with our heads, maybe we're going to go with Bill Clinton. But if we went with our hearts, we're going to go with Tom Harkin. Bill Clinton wins the nomination and then goes on to win the presidency. So, they're always going to have ideologues that are going to make that kind of the message argument, I say. But generally speaking, I'll just say this. Every candidate that wins, pretty much, this is the formula I would go by. You have to put yourself in the mainstream of your constituency and your respective opponent in the extreme. Now, if you're running in Waco, Texas, the mainstream is a lot more conservative than if you're running in San Francisco or Berkeley, California. But you still have to put yourself in the mainstream of that constituency.
You speak about messaging, and recently I interviewed a gentleman named David Fenton, who has been an activist for a long time, and he has a book called The Activist Handbook, and it's all about messaging. And he points out a couple of things. One is that the left feels that, in a sort of academic arrogance, that their policy and their plan is so genius that it's just going to sell itself, and that they don't have to stoop. Yep. They don't have to stoop to sloganeering, but they do. Whereas the simple messages of the right resonate. They understand. You say, make America great again 1 billion times. They understand that anything you say 1 billion times is going to become the truth. And that you need to, the left needs to dumb it down and say it a bunch of times over and over again. I think they do a terrible job at that. I humbly would do a better job than they do. I completely get it. You need slogans. You need to come up with some fear-mongering slogan to scare your base out of their holes. It sounds terrible, but you do. Whatever happened to Carvel? How come he's
Oh,
not? He seems to get it. Why isn't he more active in the party?
well, he is, and he was certainly did get it. And in 1992, with Bill Clinton, it was him and Paul Begala, and eventually George Stephanopoulos, who originally interviewed with Bob Kerrey, then decided to take a job with Bill Clinton, and they essentially said, "This is the person that's going to be electable." And Bill Clinton was electable, and certainly his message, it would say the economy's stupid, which was something James Carville kind of came up with, and he had that right in his right in a placard right there in the war room. He was very effective at that, but also part of what James Carville was effective of. He did this with other Democrats too, whether it was, for example, Harris Wofford in Pennsylvania, Zell Miller in 1990 running for governor of Georgia, and this is where Bill Clinton actually. Zell Miller was the guy who recommended to Bill Clinton that he should hire him. He takes the Democratic Party away from being kind of the elite party of the intelligentsia. In other words, the Democrats become this party of the professor of kind of academia, and they're seen as this party of folks who essentially only listen to NPR, who kind of look down on blue collar Americans.
Right.
And
And
it's
they do.
interesting the way when if you listen to the Democrats that actually get elected, whether it was Jimmy Carter or Bill Clinton or Joe Biden, for example, one advantage they had in terms of their speech is they did not come off as condescending.
Hmm.
There was a moment in 1992 when Bill Clinton and Ross Perot and George H.W. Bush were all in the debate. Carol Simpson was moderating. And somebody asked the question. They said, "My question is, how did the national debt affect you personally?" And Bush didn't really know what to say. She said, "Oh, if you mean interest rates." He didn't give a good answer. And then Bill Clinton, it comes right down to him. And he says, "Well, and he starts talking about the economy. And he says, when you live in a state like I do, when factories close down, he says, there's a very good possibility I might know somebody in that factory." And he looks at it and he very much, says, "How does it affect you?" And he very much was very good at kind of that one-on-one. I feel your pain, if you will.
Right.
Democrats always have that problem, though, of being seen as elitist. And when they're seen as elitist, then Republicans immediately can capitalize. They can say, "You're part of the coastal elite. You represent San Francisco. You represent Hollywood values. You represent Harvard values, and Harvard and Hollywood do not play well in the heartland," which is why the Democrats certainly have that messaging problem.
Which is why John Kerry had no chance. He was unable, even if he wanted to. He didn't have the tools to appeal to a regular person. He just was like a broken in that area. And also, unfortunately for Elizabeth Warren, that's why she should not run, because I think she would hurt the party.
A couple things on that. John Kerry in 2004, and he did this in the primary, he was basically running on his military record. And that's part of how he garnered the nomination. He was basically saying, you want to take on George W. Bush in the Iraq War, take on somebody who served in the military. Okay, that was the flagship issue of his campaign. And folks that year were looking for someone they thought could win, and they said, let's look for John Kerry. Let's select somebody who can win. We're going to say this military, and Bush, he will inoculate himself from any criticism of being a Massachusetts liberal. So he wins the nomination, and at that, when he's nominated at the convention in his home city of Boston, Max Cleland, a fellow veteran, introduces him, and John Kerry gets up and he says, "I'm John Kerry, and I'm reporting for duty." He made that his issue. So what did Karl Rove and George W. Bush do? They essentially instead of trying to ignore the military service, they ran a platform inadvertently of saying that John Kerry was only there for a very short period of time, where they would say that he protested the war. Swift Boat Veterans for Truth come out,
Right.
while these POWs come on television and saying John Kerry is not a hero. And then once you take away the military service from John Kerry, you have a Massachusetts liberal, and Massachusetts liberals are the antithesis of kind of what I think blue collar America views as working blue collar America views as these people as kind of looking down on them, elitist, all of these Ivy League educations. Interestingly, Bush had basically the same education, but
Right.
Bush was able to inoculate himself from that criticism. And Kerry in that campaign, at one point he was in Ohio, and he goes into a shop and he goes, "Is this where I can get me a hunting license?"
Right.
He was trying to be the average person. Now, in Elizabeth Warren's case,
Yeah.
very interesting, and she did this in the last campaign. She presented herself as actually what she really was, which was not a Harvard elitist, somebody who came from a very working class family from Oklahoma. Okay. And that's where essentially when she ran for Senate, when she ran for re-election, she presented herself essentially in that way. The problem is, and it's true, when she gets a job at Harvard, she's the only person who did not have an Ivy League degree at one point who taught at Harvard Law School. The problem is she taught at Harvard Law School. And as soon as you say the word Harvard, whether you're a professor there or somebody who went there, people immediately start thinking elitist, elitist, elitist. Now, George W. Bush ran for Congress in 1978, just got back from Harvard Business School. Kent Hance runs against him, and he says, in the 19th Congressional District of Texas, Texas Tech plays better than Harvard and Yale. And he says, I'll never get out Texan again, because back in 1994, develops a little bit of a Texan drawl, and he becomes a Texan, and eventually people start to see him as a Texan.
Right.
So there are some people who can kind of inoculate themselves from that. But generally speaking, if you come from, say, a Southern Baptist background, the way that Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton did, even though they both had elite educations, Jimmy Carter went to Annapolis, Bill Clinton went to Georgetown, Yale, and Oxford, that Southern accent really helps and it inoculates them from that excoriation.
I was just going to say that the way you speak is underestimated. The your education can count against you, can be used against you, and I'll get to that in a minute. But more important than that are your speech patterns. And you can't Harvard the Texas out of George Bush. Right?
He was pretty good at it, though.
And by the way, didn't DeSantis go to Harvard too?
Yeah, but he's going to be. You know what? It doesn't. If you're a Republican, you can still use it against somebody else. George H.W. Bush, who went to Phillips Academy in Andover, went to Yale. He ran against Mike Dukakis, and he talked about Mike Dukakis's foreign policy. He said it probably came right out of the Harvard boutique. Mitt Romney, who also went to Harvard, when he switched his view on abortion when he was governor, he had been a supporter of abortion rights. He said essentially that he met with a Harvard professor, and the Harvard professor was talking about stem cell research and was showing him essentially, stem cells. And he basically said, oh, this is just, we discard this. And Mitt Romney supposedly came out of it and said, I've after meeting with this, I've decided that we need to really respect life. But you know what? The fact that he did this at Harvard, this benefits him either way. On the one side, if the guy actually comes after him, then Mitt Romney can say, I'm in the Republican primary and I'm taking on Harvard. Even though I have associations with Harvard, I'm a governor of Massachusetts at the time. I'm taking on the elites at Harvard. And if he says nothing, then people will say, oh, well, maybe he really, maybe this was, essentially goodwill, and maybe this was something from the heart for Mitt Romney. So you can take on Harvard even if you actually went to Harvard. But if you're a Republican, if you're a Democrat and you take on Harvard, people will, like the way John Kerry tries to essentially kind of de-Ivy League himself, it didn't necessarily work.
Anybody who says the politics is not interesting needs to listen to this show with you. You make it very interesting. Now, speaking of education, people talk about the economic divide between the right and left and various divides between the right and left. But I think that underappreciated is the education divide and what that has to do with self-identity on both sides. And the real dislike, I think in many cases, is blue-collar folks looking at educated Northeastern folks and hating them for that reason. Mm-hmm. And the obvious dismissal of the educated elite of blue-collar from the corner, other corners of the country. That doesn't really get addressed as much as I would think it would. And I hope that the Democrats are in the next presidential cycle, in the next elections, pay attention to how important this is. I hope they hear our message and put forward somebody that has a manner of speaking that doesn't allow their education, either way, their education or their lack of education, to be used against them.
Well, I think, first of all, that Joe Biden, assuming he is going to run, I think he's only going to have nominal opposition for the Democratic nomination. He probably will win the nomination because I don't think anyone's going to consolidate against him. And I think that Joe Biden, that is part of why he won the nomination in the first place. That's part of why Barack Obama chose him in 2008 as his vice presidential running mate, is that when he speaks, he does very much sound like an average American. And that means he makes mistakes. He makes malapropisms. George W. Bush spoke Exact same thing. He sounded like an average American. Whereas someone like John Kerry, I think someone like, frankly, Mitt Romney, Mitt Romney would talk. There was a debate with Mitt Romney and Shannon O'Brien. Remember this in 2002, running for governor. The very end, Tim Russert says, and I hope you all enjoy the Buffalo Bills New England Patriots game on Sunday. And Mitt Romney comes up and says, and may the best team win.
No.
You think, who actually talks like that? Like,
nobody.
As corny as it was, rah, rah, Mitt. And you say, who talks like that? Then he uses, instead of airplane, he calls them an aircraft. And he says something's a null set. That's not the way the average person talks. John Kerry, very similar to that. But you do very much have to dumb down your message. And that is something Donald Trump is actually very good at.
Right.
Despite his background. I mean, this is fascinating. Despite the fact that this is somebody from New York City who's lived a very secular lifestyle, yet he is still able to be seen as a tribune to evangelicals in the South, for example.
I know. Right.
To blue collar voters that view him as part of kind of the leader or the president, if you will, of the out group.
Right.
They think that people who think they're a member of an out group view Donald Trump as, in many respects, one of them. Now, would they have thought of, what would they think of him 10 years ago? I don't know. In the 2016 Republican primary, evangelicals probably would have been with someone like Ted Cruz. But you know what? He won them over. And now when they think of Donald Trump, they think that guy's one of us. He represents us, despite this is contrary, to his background. And that's really kind of the genius of Donald Trump.
Ted Cruz is another guy who managed to avoid the pitfall of a an elite education. he doesn't act it really. Ted Cruz, though, and this is similar to John Kerry. I think he does have problems relating to people, and he does have a likability factor. In the United States Senate, for example, there are very few people that actually like him because a lot of them view him as kind of an opportunist. As soon as he gets elected in 2012, 2015, he's announced he's running for president. So his job, he didn't really want to necessarily go there to kind of go along and get along and try to get legislation through. The thought was he was essentially here just so that he could run for president. And so some senators, I think, kind of say, we're the workhorses. You're the show horse. You're always out around the country. But he doesn't come off as particularly charismatic the way, frankly, that Donald Trump does, the way to a certain degree Ron DeSantis does, the way that Nikki Haley does, for example, Tim Scott does. He certainly does have that likability problem. And I think sometimes it is hard for somebody with that elite of an education that Ted Cruz has, going to Harvard Law. Alan Dershowitz said he was one of the best students he's ever had. But when you go to Harvard Law, there's a point of diminishing returns. If you don't go to college, then you can say I'm kind of one of the people, and you're actually advantageous or beneficial to you politically. One more question. Of the possible challenges to Trump, Nikki Haley is listed as one of them. Who are the other 4 or 5, and what sort of shot do they have? And can you talk a little bit, describe them and what their strengths and weaknesses might be? Start with Nikki Haley.
The one I'll start with Nikki Haley. She's a former governor of South Carolina, became a UN ambassador under the Trump administration. So she's kind of a governor with foreign policy credentials, if you will. Relatively popular in South Carolina. She was reelected in South Carolina. She's somebody who would probably be very formidable in the general election. She'll have a problem if Tim Scott runs in terms of where the money from South Carolina is going to go to. My guess is folks in South Carolina would want to give more money to Tim Scott because they might actually want something from him. It's like when the caucus announced he's running for president. A lot of people in Massachusetts gave money to him because they thought he was going to lose, and they wanted him to still be they wanted to somehow to benefit them, politically, that they say, we supported you in the general election. So Tim Scott, African-American United States Senator from South Carolina, gave the Republican response to Joe Biden on his first address to Congress back in 2021. Very charismatic. I can definitely see somewhat of an avenue for him. Mike Pompeo, former Secretary of State, former congressman from Kansas. I don't necessarily see where his avenue really is. I don't know where. Well, if you're running on foreign policy, first of all, you have a problem because voters generally, unless there's a major war, aren't thinking about foreign policy. At least Nikki Haley can say domestic and foreign policy, but I don't see where his necessarily base of support is. Asa Hutchinson, governor of Arkansas, outgoing governor of Arkansas, former congressman from Arkansas, former drug czar in the Bush administration. I mean, Bill Clinton and Mike Huckabee certainly overperformed expectations as governors of Arkansas running in primaries, but I don't see where Asa Hutchinson galvanizes a lot of support. He's kind of right in between the kind of Trump wing and the anti-Trump wing, if you will. Greg Abbott, governor of Texas, a possibility. I don't think he's going to run. Ron DeSantis, the one that's got nearly ecumenical name recognition. He can run the same way George W. Bush did. George W. Bush in 1998 won 68% of the vote, talked about how he won 49% of the Latino vote, how he won 60% of the female vote, and how he won 25% of the African American vote. Ron DeSantis, the largest win of any Republican governor in the history of the state, first governor since 2002, since Jeb Bush to win Republican governor to win Miami-Dade County, and he defeated Charlie Crist, who's a former governor, a pretty formidable person. So he can go around the country and he can say, if I can do this in Florida, in what is kind of a showdown state, I can win in the general election. His problem is going to be Donald Trump. I think Donald Trump has got kind of incensed by him because Donald Trump views that he was the one who founded, who really created him. If you go back to 2018, Adam Putnam, the agriculture commissioner, was the establishment front runner. And then Trump comes in. He didn't know Adam Putnam and endorsed this congressman, the insurrectionist candidate, Ron DeSantis. And Ron DeSantis ends up winning. Trump takes credit for that. Then he ends up winning by just less than a point over Adam Gilliam, the mayor of Tallahassee, Andrew Gilliam, in the general election. So Trump and him will really, really go after each other. Then you have these kind of anti-Trump candidates. Larry Hogan, the outgoing governor of Maryland. My guess is the fact that he's anti-Trump is probably a non-starter for a Republican nominee. Also, he supports abortion rights, which will probably make him a non-starter. Bill Hurd, the former congressman from Texas, very much a moderate. My guess is he's probably too moderate for the nomination. Congresswoman Cheney, I don't see where Congressman Cheney goes anywhere because she took on Donald Trump, but potentially she could be become kind of a tribune of, I guess, the anti-Trump wing, maybe for 2028 if Trump runs and then gets annihilated. And then you have Adam Kinzinger, the former congressman from Illinois. He's somebody who's kind of a possibility as kind of an anti-Trump candidate. I don't necessarily see where his base of support is right now, but maybe he has one at some point. And then Christine Noem, the governor of South Dakota, very charismatic, just off of her re-election bid, former United States congressperson. She's somebody that I think will probably compete with the same constituencies of Nikki Haley, but she's governor of South Dakota, and not a lot of people are going to be giving money to someone who's governor of such a small state. She's also been very loyal to Donald Trump, and I'm not sure she would necessarily ingress into a race where Donald Trump is in that, where Donald Trump is also in that race. And then you have others that I don't think are going to run. I don't think Marco Rubio will run because the Florida money is probably going to go to DeSantis. Ted Cruz, I don't know if he necessarily would run against Donald Trump just because from an opportunistic standpoint, I don't see where his base of support necessarily is. If Trump wasn't running, I think he would do very well. Mike Pence, former congressman from Indiana, chairman of the Republican Conference, former governor of Indiana, vice president. I don't see where his base of support is. There's going to be some evangelicals that will support him who are somewhat distraught by Donald Trump, but I think for the most part, most of those evangelicals will stay on the reservation for Donald Trump, and then we probably have a litany or bevy of other candidates who probably never even thought of that might run as well.
I would think that a political campaign would hire you because your knowledge of the political history and the strategies that worked and didn't work, and your reasoning as to why things work and don't work, I don't know, to my naive ears sounds like top notch. I would think that you would be a natural to work for a campaign.
I think I'm too crooked.
Crooked how?
I'm being facetious.
I see. You can be crooked and work for a campaign.
Yes, I know. I
mean, obviously, you can be crooked and
run
in a campaign. There's a lot of crooked people. You could be the good Roger Stone.
Oh yes, absolutely. Roger Stone. Interestingly, Roger Stone, the dirty trickster for the Nixon campaign, but there was also a dirty trickster for the Kennedy campaign. If you go back, his name was Dick Tuck. And here's why I say he's fascinating. When Nixon was running for Senate in 1950, Dick Tuck was a Democratic activist. So Dick Tuck but he was also a student at the University of California. So Dick Tuck and Helen Hagen Douglas was the Democratic nominee, and he was secretly working for her. So he pretends he's working for the college Republicans and invites Nixon to speak at the university, and he accepts. So Dick Tuck accordingly rents the biggest room in the entire, the biggest auditorium basically in the entire college, There's like 20,000 seats there. Doesn't advertise it or tell anybody. Only 6 people show up. Richard Nixon's there, and then Dick Tick sits there and gives a 20-minute introduction to Richard Nixon, basically saying nothing, and says, "And I've invited Congressman Nixon running for the United States Senate, and his speech will be solely on international monetary policy."
Wow.
And then he ran for Senate later in life. He ran for state Senate in 1966 in California. And after he lost, he said, "The people have spoken, the bastards."
Well, we need to save something for next time. This went over an hour and 5 minutes and 17 seconds, because
But
it's
who's
interesting.
counting?
And not only the discussion is interesting, I learned so much from speaking to you. I don't know anything, but I know a little bit more each time I speak to you, and I really appreciate it.
Socratic wisdom.
So where are you on? Have any other radio appearances coming up soon? Are you going to be anywhere where people can hear you speak?
Well, just if you go to my Facebook page, Rich Rubino, Rubino, you can see some of the interviews I did. I'm doing a lot with Ryan Recker, who used to be on in St. Louis, who's now appearing in Milwaukee and sometimes in Buffalo and sometimes South Carolina, around the country. I've been appearing on his show a couple of times, and also Hank Stoltz sometimes in WCRN in Worcester.
Oh, good. So you have the links to those on your website?
Yes, I do.
RichRubino.com?
No, just Facebook. Just type in Rich and then Rubino. You'll see a picture of me holding my latest book.
So it's on
American
Facebook.
Political Trivia Challenge, available at $20 on Amazon.com.
Yeah, and now, yes, of course. The other books, there are a bunch of books, 5 books, in fact. They're all great Christmas gifts, particularly the Great American Trivia Challenge. Talk about the books, and that one especially.
Yeah, I'm Congenital Political Junkie, the first book, a political Bible of little-known facts in American politics, all the interesting facts you've probably never thought of, like the fact that under the Articles of Confederation or Perpetual Union, the precursor to the Constitution, they had an office called the Office of President of Congress Assembled. John Hanson was the first president, so his family believes he should be considered the real first president of the United States. Okay? Second book, The Political Bible of Humorous Quotations in American Politics. And some interesting quotations. The best one I think of is the one that was not actually said. Everett Dirksen, former Senate Minority Leader, Senator from Illinois, supposedly said $1 billion here, $1 billion there, and pretty soon you're talking about some real money.
Right.
So he was in an airplane, and someone sat next to him and said, "I just want to say, Senator Dirksen, I love that quote." Senator Dirksen retorts, "Oh, no, son, I never said that. It's just such a darn good quote, I never bothered to deny it."
Right.
And then American Politics on the Rocks, very all-encompassing. Make Every Vote Equal, What a Novel Idea, talks about the Electoral College. And the last book, The Great American Political Trivia Challenge, political trivia on steroids, basically about 2,512 questions and answers. And I think some of the interesting ones would probably be the fact that President Rutherford B. Hayes, well, almost forgotten in the United States, is an absolute legend in the country of Paraguay, because when he was president, his Secretary of State, William Evarts, negotiated an agreement between Paraguay and Argentina, where about 60% of the Chaco land was given to Paraguay. So accordingly, in Paraguay, there's a national holiday for him. There's a soccer team there for him. There's a villa named after him. And there was interestingly, there was a child who came, "What can we give you as a gift?" The young woman said, "I'd like to go to the Rutherford B. Hayes Presidential Library Museum in Fremont, Ohio." Now, contrary to that, in the United States, his birthplace in Delaware, Ohio, Rutherford B. Hayes, by the way, he's the only president born in Delaware, Ohio, is actually a gas station now. His house was torn down in 1926. There's a little plaque saying it's Rutherford B. Hayes' birthplace. You can learn everything you can about Rutherford B. Hayes. I know all the Rutherford B. Hayes nation out there would absolutely love this, but that's my latest book.
Well, no respect for Rutherford B. Hayes.
Not here.
A plaque on a gas station. A plaque on a gas station. That's
down there, he's an absolute he is an absolute legend. By the way, interestingly, he did a lot for Ohio State University when he was governor of Ohio, and actually got on the board of trustees after he left the governorship. And he went to Kenyon College for undergraduate, but he actually did go to Harvard for graduate school. So he's very much, I guess you could say, an Ivy League elitist, even though he is very much also somebody from Ohio, and he was someone who was able to somewhat differentiate the two.
Okay. As far as I go, I'm happy to report to you, Rich Rubino, that you didn't know probably, but I was working on an album, a musical album which is finished and it's out now. The band is called Bridge Bender.
Oh, awesome.
And the album is available on Spotify and Apple Music and stuff. But I also posted a link to it on my Facebook page. It came out very well. And folks, this broadcast goes out to Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. It'll mean a great deal to me if you go to my YouTube pages, The Bradley J Show and Bradley J Travel, and subscribe. It doesn't cost anything, but the subscriptions or subs mean a lot. We work for subscriptions. So if you could go there and subscribe, that'd be great. Then and follow, click the bell to follow. And both Rich and I will share the heck out of this. That's where we, reach the way we reach a lot of people. I share to Massachusetts cities and towns and political groups. And if you, in your town in Massachusetts, share it to your town group, that'd mean a lot.
Yes.
And it's kind of fun to join political groups, progressive groups, conservative groups. And if you do join, share this there. And we'll probably talk to you next week. We're kind of doing it every week, I guess, which is fine with me. And Rich and I will put our heads together and come up with next week's topic. I guess that's it. Wow, that's almost a record, an hour and 10 minutes.
Categorically.
For us, it's a record. I think it's the all-time record for a broadcast, one of these streaming broadcasts. So thank you. It was a fun time. And think about, Rich, we'll talk about it right now after we go off the air, maybe what we want to do next time. Thanks to Lola Pope, not only for being a contributor today, but also a long time and very good friend. I just want to say thank you for all you do. And the rest of you, Will Lyons, and I'm not going to name everybody, but thank you for your support as well. Bye all, and thanks again, Rich Rubino.